ticking down. Hello everyone and welcome to our Hidden Libraries podcast, Deeper the Roots, with its author, Stephen Bourne. This is the book we're going to be talking about today, Deeper the Roots. But before we begin, I'd like to apologise to people who may have been expecting us to begin some minutes ago. We had a slight technical issue that we had to overcome. So, thank you very much for joining us, Stephen. I'm just going to do. I'll tell people what the podcast is about. So the podcast is about this book written by Stephen. It's about the experience of black actors and black performers in British theatre and musical from the early 19th century through to the late 20th century. So this is actually a library book, you can see. So after the podcast, please come into the library, get the copy and read it. Also, anyone interested in asking Stephen some questions, you can do that. This is an interactive podcast and we can pass those questions on to Stephen for you. Thanks again for your patience, everyone, and also to Stephen. Okay then, Stephen, shall we begin? Question number one. Okie dokes. Right. You write in your book, Deeper the Roots is a personal history of your experience of black performers in theatre and musical. Now, were there any advantages or disadvantages with this perspective in contrast to approaching it from an impersonal, objective perspective or something that might be considered more academic?
It was a deliberate decision on my part. I've got a terrible echo, which is going to drive me mad. Is there anything that can be done about that?
Oh, I don't. Let me see if I can put my...
Sorry.
See my earphones help.
Every time I say something, it repeats back at me.
Ah, I'm not getting a repeat here.
No?
No.
No, it's gone now.
Oh, it might have been maybe the earphones has taken it away.
Right. Okay. I'll go back to the question. Thank you for the question.
Sure.
Yeah, it was purely a conscious decision on my part. I've been writing Black British history books for 30 years. The best known one is Black Poppies. So I do the book plug to be first. And I'd always approached books in that objective academic way. I'm not from an academic background, really. I've done academic work, but I don't consider myself an academic. I'm not a professor. I don't use words ending in ology. I like to write I like to write history books that are anecdotal, that in which interviews with people that created the history are paramount. But with this particular one, I said to my editor at the History Press, can I just try and write it from a personal point of view and put myself in the story? Because I met many of the people that I write about, from like Ira Aldridge from the 1800s, clearly I didn't know, but some of them I did, and I just thought it would be wonderful to put the story of my journey, if you like, into the book while telling the stories of the black actors and dramatists. I mean, the book does end in 1975. I need to sort of clarify that. It doesn't cover the whole period, but that's, my editor thought it was a great idea. So I when I started writing it, it just made the writing process so much easier.
And also some of the people that you spoke to, that you did meet and you did know, they knew earlier performers themselves or had met them. So in a way, perhaps...
In some cases, yes. I mean, for example, I met, way back in the 1980s, I worked as a consultant on a Paul Robeson exhibition for the old Greater London Authority, the GLC, Ken Livingstone, that's at County Hall. They funded it. And the Paul Robeson exhibition was at the Royal Festival Hall. So it was a very high-profile event and properly funded. I worked as a consultant. Even then, as young as I was, I knew about Paul Robeson's film and theatre work. But I got to meet C.L.R. James, the Trinidadian historian and writer. I got to meet Peggy Ashcroft, Dame Peggy Ashcroft, who had played Desdemona opposite Paul Robeson in 1930 at the Savoy Theatre in London. I'd already befriended Elizabeth Welch, who is also featured in the book, but she was a film actress, a film and stage actress, but she worked opposite Paul Robeson in a couple of films. and so on and so on. I met that early generation of people that knew him. He died in 1976, but I also met his son twice, Paul Robeson Jr., both at the 1985 exhibition, which he came over from America to open, and also later on the 2001 Paul Robeson exhibition at the Theatre Museum in Covent Garden. So you're right, I did get to meet older generations of people that either knew Paul Robeson or worked with him.
And I suppose that live avenue into the subject through people in front of you speaking is obviously much more infusing and human than just reading dry history books and records and things. So
absolutely,
that real spark.
Because you see, absolutely, because this is what, from my perspective, academics don't do. They don't engage with the human side of. They can write very good, thorough, worthy books, history books, whatever. But that isn't how I wanted to write this book. I wanted to put those testimonies in, but also put myself into the story. And when you read the book, it is meant to be semi-autobiographical, but without detracting from the main narrative of the story, which is Black theatre practitioners in Britain in the early formative years.
And I think that approach does give the advantage that when you're reading the book, you get perhaps a greater sense of the personalities of the people that you've met. You know, from my perspective, reading it.
I hope so. I can't comment. You'd have to tell me if
I think you did.
You did.
Yeah.
Well, then I've set out to do what I wanted to do, which was to bring those people alive on the pages of the book, and how I remember them, and how I built friendships and forged friendships with them, and I'm still friends with some of them today. Some of the survivors, that are still friends. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think that personable aspect of it, you know, it does definitely enliven it. As in contrast, I read quite a lot of academic books as well and things, but it does give it a different tone. Definitely.
That's what I wanted.
Well, maybe moving on to the next question, which is perhaps the other side. How difficult was it to obtain all the question, and particularly with the earlier period that you write about, when obviously going right back to Ira Aldridge and people like that, was how available is the information, the historical record, and was that very difficult to kind of gather together?
Well, you see, not coming from an academic background, when I was younger, even before I worked on the Paul Robeson exhibition, as a teenager in the 1970s, when I'm still at school, I'm becoming interested in the subject. And because I don't come from a university background, I had to learn how to teach myself how to research. And that required a great deal of dedication and a great deal of concentration and seeking out information. And it wasn't that difficult, because somehow I discovered that Westminster Reference Library, I come from London, so it wasn't difficult to get to Westminster Reference Library, and down in the dungeons, in the cellars of the Reference Library, they had the who's who in the theatre, all these volumes going right back to before the 1920s. And I just used to go and just go and sit and scan pages of all these cast lists, endless cast lists of West End productions. It was limited because it was West End London only, not the provinces or outside of London. But it was a start to do methodical research in chronicling, and that's why there's this huge database at the end of the book, because that work started then, and I've added to it. And it was really a question of familiarizing myself with the names of people, of Black actors and writers in the 30s, in the 40s, looking at the cast lists of Paul Robeson's plays of the 1930s, London plays, and seeing what other Black actors they could have been. It actually wasn't as difficult as you might think in the days before we had internet, in the days before we had access to the British newspaper archive, unless you physically went there and went through the newspapers yourself. So there were resources around. You just had to use your imagination as I did, and ask lots of questions of people that might know, and then you find your way through.
So in terms of some of the performers and their shows often took place in the regions of Britain, did that mean that you had to go travelling off to different libraries around the country?
No, I never. I never had the fortunate to be able to do that, because I just didn't have the resources. I didn't have the money. I didn't have any funding. This was back in the 1980s. I had to, in terms of theatre, because at the same time I'm also researching black presence in British cinema and television and radio, so I'm doing the whole lot. But theatre was difficult outside London because there was no documentation available then, unless, as you say, you have the resources to go to Liverpool and Cardiff, and regional theatres. But that information is more readily available now. But again, it was just too much work to do that thoroughly for the new book. That's something for somebody else to do. Yeah.
Well, my next question you kind of covered in a way, but it definitely sounds you kind of just set off and did it off your own back, off your own initiative, but sort of by your own curiosity and desire to know and to record that as well. And not just in this subject, but others relating.
Absolutely, and also discovering in the 1980s that some of those actors that started after the war, the kind of Windrush generation of actors, for want of a better term, were still around. Some of them were still working. Some of them were working with the Black Theatre Cooperative and Talawar, and the older generation were working with the younger generation of black actors in this country. So that was fascinating to see black theatre productions in the 80s, when there was a kind of boom and funding from, again, the GLC mainly, funding black theatre companies in the 1980s. That period is not covered so much in the book other than in the introduction. But then going off and interviewing some of these older actors, I was always interested in the older generation. So 1989 is when I really started. So I interviewed Pearl Connor Magotzi, and Pearl Connor Magotzi had previously been married to Edric Connor, who I was fascinated by, a Trinidadian. They were both Trinidadian trailblazers. Started one of the very first black theatre workshops back in the early 1960s, and many other things. And meeting Pearl, just, if Pearl trusted you and liked you, she would start phoning other black theatre practitioners up of her generation. I remember she phoned Isabel Lucas and Frank Singueno, two of the older generation, and endorsed me, recommended me. When this young white man comes and phones you up, don't worry, he's genuine. He's genuine. And one of the things that I discovered with that generation was how proud they were of the things that they achieved. They did not want to talk about racism. They did not want to talk about the lack of opportunities, because alongside the racism and the lack of opportunities were opportunities at places like the Royal Court and interesting work. And they wanted to talk about the positive things and the things that they achieved, because no one else had. Pearl Connor told me that there's a hole in the ground and we fall into it. And if it wasn't for people like me, then this story would never be documented. It's a shame it took so long for the book to get published, but we can come back to that, why that book was denied a publication for many years. But I got there in the end, and the book is a tribute to people like Pearl, those people, and Isabel and Frank, who are no longer with us. It's a tribute to them and a testament to their hard work and dedication to their craft, but who never got the recognition.
And that sounds like one of the advantages of your approach, the personal approach. Perhaps if you as you said, if you'd gone a different route or somebody else had gone the other way, maybe that connection wouldn't have happened, and then that knowledge wouldn't have been found. It's
a personal approach, but it's also about trust. And I think a lot of the people I met and befriended trusted me. I knew about the existence of a black actress who was actually Jamaican, came here as a child with her family in 1919, a middle-class Jamaican family, Pauline Henriquez. And Pauline went to drama school at LAMDA, London Academy of Music and Dramatic Art, in 1932, because she was passionate about the theatre. She wanted to be an actress. There was no work for her. There were no opportunities, but she'd long since given up the profession. She gave up the profession in the late 1950s. But Pearl put me in touch with her. She was retired. Pauline was retired, living in Brighton. And I tracked her down, went down to Brighton to see her. This was in 1989, and we became best friends. But she was just amazed that anyone knew that she'd been an actress, a professional actress, and told me so many amazing stories about being a drama student in the 1930s in London, and that when she left drama school, she did struggle to get acting work, but she had a career of sorts. And she said the most wonderful opportunity came for her in 1950 when she played Emilia in a touring version of Othello, Shakespeare's Othello, with an African-American actor called Gordon Heath. There's a chapter about this in the book, playing Othello, and they toured the theatreless towns of Britain. And Pauline said, once I'd got up on stage many times to do Shakespeare's lines, I couldn't go back to playing American maids in these American plays that needed a stupid maid kind of role on the stage. So she said I gradually withdrew from the acting profession. But she actually physically gave me her little box of photographs, and I said, I can't possibly keep them. Your family should have these. So I borrowed them, copied them, and gave the originals back to Pauline. And some of those pictures are in the book. Pictures of her as Emilia in Othello in 1950. And she was so proud of that opportunity and that performance.
Yeah, there are some good pictures in the book. Definitely. Well, I think I'll move on to my next question then, which is kind of relating to everything you've said. And it's later on, after you kind of really got going and started to get established and you received recognition and funding from certain organisations, did this have a big change in your approach to your research or in any other way?
It did help. The first little tiny weeny bit of funding I got was funny enough, I found, going through my filing cabinets, I've got a lot of filing cabinets. I actually didn't realise this when I wrote the book, Deep Are the Roots, that I actually applied to the Society for Theatre Research for a grant to do this research as early as 1994, and they rejected me. I had a rejection letter from them, and I'd forgotten, that nearly 30 years ago, when I first applied to the Society for Theatre Research, that they turned me down. And then 5 years later, I tried again, and they did give me a very tiny grant, which was match funded by the Theatre Museum, which was then in Covent Garden, to go in and research their Black theatre holdings. So they would have like files on Paul Robeson and other prominent Black actors, but there was no catalogue. So we put together a catalogue of Black performance at the Theatre Museum, the archives, and that proved to be very useful for anyone going into the Theatre Museum. So that was 2001. Around the same time, I worked with them on the second Paul Robeson exhibition. But I then applied for and was awarded a Wingate scholarship in the very last year that they did with these Wingate scholarships. I think they've now been resurrected, but this was back in, I can't remember, 2007, 2008. So I was able to do a bit more research. And the object was to take that grant money and do more in-depth research and more systematic research that needed to be done, although I'd done a lot of research already, and add to it, and then get a book published. And there the story ended, because in 2011, in fact, writing Deep Are the Roots, in my filing cabinet, I found the list of 11 publishers in 2010, 2011, all of whom rejected this book. And I wrote in red letters next to the the publisher's name, too niche, what was it? Rejected, too niche, rejected. And I knew what I was up against. You see, the publishing world as I'm sure a lot of people listening in will know if they know anything about publishing, a very white, very middle class. This was 12, 13 years ago. It's still the same now. There's still very little cultural diversity in the publishing world. That really needs to change. So I was up against very white, very middle class people in the publishing world. I couldn't get a literary agent for love or money. They all turned me down as well. Too niche, too niche, too niche. I even had a literary agent said to me, coloured, she used the word coloured. Coloured people don't buy books. There's no market for them. So this is what I was up against. And that's not that long ago. I think now the big sea change in attitude has happened somewhat because of the Black Lives Matter movement, the George Floyd, the Black Lives Matter movement has sort of shifted a little bit. And certainly my publisher, the History Press, was very interested in my doing this book. So that's how that came about. But the rejections were very painful. And I gave up on it. I actually gave up on the book. Thought I was never going to get published. So I just stuck it in the filing cabinet, the proposal, and forgot about it until the History Press asked me if I had any more proposals, because I've done Black Poppies. Black Poppies have done really well. So I came up with this one, and that's how it came about.
So do you think if there had been a positive reaction, like 20 odd years before, for the same subject that you wanted to write about, do you think that being able to write it earlier would have changed the book in any way?
I don't know. I can't answer that. I would imagine I would have written it very similarly to how I've written it now. I would hope that I would have had the confidence to write it personally. But if I hadn't, it still would have been an interesting book. Not because of me, but because of the people that I wanted to put in the book. And I knew enough about their lives and had enough information to make it an interesting book. So the book should have been published 20 years ago, or it should have been published 10 years ago. But it wasn't. It now exists as it is in 2022. Okay. Yeah. Better late than never.
Yeah, very true. Well, okay, let's we've talked a lot about the process of your writing and gathering information and your personal relationship with the subject. But I thought now we'll move on to the performers themselves. And first question is about Ira Aldridge. I'll just give the listeners and viewers a brief introduction. He was an American actor. He came to Britain. He was the first black actor to play Othello in Britain in 1825 when he was just 18 years old. There's a few achievements there, isn't there? And performed many Shakespearean roles during his career, toured around Britain, on the continent as well, became a British citizen in 1863. He was one of the characters, or people I should say, that I found most interesting in the book, thinking particularly back to that period. I wondered if you could expand upon his life and give us a sense of what he was like as an actor and how his performances were received.
I found a review, I can't remember off the top of my head, I'd have to go back to the book, but there was something I found in a wartime magazine where somebody wrote about his performances in Russia, I think it was, and was very descriptive about his greatness on stage. So, but there's lots of examples of that, even in this country. He was never allowed to act in America, his home country. He came to Britain, as you say, when he was very young, and didn't just play Othello. I mean, he played a whole range of Shakespearean roles. I mean, he played King Lear, and he played many other stage roles that he felt suited to, other than Shakespeare, and was very prolific and was very successful in Britain and Europe and Russia and all those amazing places. And it's extraordinary what he managed to achieve. He was very much part of the anti-slavery movement, and the pro-slavery campaigners were very much against him and would write terrible things about his performances. But he captured the imagination of the Victorian theatre audiences, and he was always up there with the great stage actors of this country. And there's always been this misconception that he was the last black actor to play Othello in England until Paul Robeson did the role in 1930. But there are other examples, and I write about one of them. There's very little known about him that I managed to find out a bit more for this book, called Paul Molyneux, who followed in the wake of Ira Aldridge. But Ira Aldridge was one of the great Victorians, really. I mean, he was a great Shakespearean actor, a great Victorian, and a great ambassador for the black race, if you like, at that time.
Okay. Well, leading on from that, the issue about Americans, many of the performers you write about in your book were American origin. They came from America. Would you say that within Britain there was a greater awareness of black American culture than, say, West Indian culture or that of any other countries? And did that affect their popularity?
Certainly African American expatriates or African American visitors who worked in mainly the music halls, because before the existence of television and before the existence of radio didn't become invented until 1922, television much later. Music halls were the staple form of entertainment for the masses, for the working classes, for the middle classes, for the upper classes. So there were like thousands and thousands of music halls all over the country, and black artists, whether they be from America or Africa or Cardiff or Liverpool, were celebrated and respected, and they had very successful careers. There's so many from the Victorian and Edwardian era, and they're coexisting in music halls at the same time as blackface minstrelsy. So you could go to a show and see blackface minstrelsy, which we now quite rightly condemn as racist. Later became popular on BBC television as the Black and White Minstrels show. Even when I was a child, that was on.
Yeah, I remember that.
But back then, they coexisted, and this is why I'm always keen to promote the positive narrative, as that there isn't just a negative racist narrative, there's a positive narrative. And when you look at photographs of some of those early black artists, male and female, men and women, they projected a very sophisticated, elegant image, which for British audiences was very much welcomed and embraced.
Thank you very much.
I do talk about some of them in the book, like Amy Height and Williams and Walker. There's many of them. Many.
Oh yeah, there's quite a few in the book for those who wish to read it. And a lot of information about them. It's quite interesting, that whole period of the musical and people's roles in it.
It is.
Great.
Needs more attention, I think.
Well, let's shift now to after the Second World War. And I thought it was interesting, again, we're kind of with the American aspect. Lots of well-known American performers were kind of brought over or employed in Britain. And sometimes they seem to be favoured over, say, West Indian or African performers in Britain. Do you think that's to do with the kind of perception that sort of black American culture was more popular? And also, if that hadn't been a factor, do you think that those non-American black performers in Britain may have been in a better position to find work and gain a wider audience base?
It was tough. The post-war sort of years, the 1950s, there was this casting directors, producers, all of whom would have been white, in our theatres, favoured the African Americans. And there was a famous case in 1958 when the Royal Court staged Errol John's play, Moon on a Rainbow Shore. Errol John was a Trinidadian actor, had written this wonderful play called Moon on a Rainbow Shore, set in Trinidad. The Royal Court picked it up. It was done on BBC Radio first, and then the Royal Court staged it. But unfortunately, whoever produced it or directed it decided that the main roles would go to African Americans. So they brought over, I think they brought over 3 African Americans like Vinette Carroll, Earl Hyman, who were wonderful actors. But Pearl Connor, who I mentioned earlier, had already established herself not as an actress, but as an agency. She ran the Edric Connor Agency. Her husband, Edric Connor, was a folk singer who became a well-known actor. But because there was very little representation of black actors in this country in the 1950s, they set up this agency, the Edric Connor Agency, in 1956. Well, Pearl just hit the roof when these African Americans were being brought over to do this play. The same thing happened the following year with A Raisin in the Sun, Lorraine Hansberry's brilliant Broadway production that starred Sidney Poitier, his first sort of real success in the theatre. And that was brought over, but with a different cast. Sidney didn't come to London to do this play. They cast Earl Hyman again. Again, wonderful actor, but they brought over an African-American actress to play the female lead. There were smaller roles played by black British actors, whether they be from the West Indies or Africa, which was the same with Moon on a Rainbow Shore. But the fight began sort of there, and Pearl was at the front of it. And certainly, if you look into the newspaper articles of the time, the stage newspaper, she's fighting the corner of her African Caribbean actors on her books who are losing out. But this tradition carried on when you think about the 1960s and you think about some of the films, British films, that use African American actors as opposed to black British actors. They did lose out, but it was something that carried right on, dare I say, until Denzel Washington did For Queen and Country, the film in 1987. And Denzel Washington's Peckham accent is as bad as Dick Van Dyke's Cockney in Mary Poppins. So it sometimes doesn't really work, but it did cause a lot of resentment back then because there was limited opportunities. And when the opportunities came to play the leading roles, the African Americans would be brought over.
Right. Okay. Thank you. You write about various black theatre groups that were founded after the war and the following decades. They had varying degrees of success. I wondered what you would say would be the lasting effect of these groups.
Well, again, we really need to look at them closely and see how they evolve, because the very early black theatre companies, if we want to call them that, I mean, they never had funding, they never had a home base. It starts in a way with Robert Adams, who was Guyanese, and he tried to establish that what was then the word they used then was Negro, the Negro Repertory Company or Negro Repertory Theatre in 1944, as early as that. And he managed to stage a production at Colchester Repertory Company of Eugene O'Neill's All Gotch Chillin', which Paul Robeson had done the original production in America, and Robert played the lead in that. But no funding, no support, nothing. And so it's all very hit and miss until the 1960s. There were like black theatre attempts at black theatre companies come and go. I've tried to document as many as I could. And then in 1961, Edric and Pearl founded the Negro Theatre Workshop. But that was important because it couldn't get proper funding, it couldn't get a proper base, but it did go out and stage their own productions like Bethlehem Blues and The Dark Disciples with black British casts. So a lot of the actors we're familiar with now, in some respect, like Rudolph Walker, who's in EastEnders, started out with the Black Theatre Workshop, the Negro Theatre Workshop in the early 60s. A lot of the more recent, older black actors started their careers back then with them. And this is alongside, as I say, the Royal Court was doing some amazing productions with black actors. And, all tribute to Edric and Pearl for starting that company. It didn't last more than 6 or 7 years, but because the support just wasn't there. It isn't until around 1970-71 that the Dark and Light Theatre, Frank Cousins, pulls together the Dark and Light Theatre, and they're given a home base in Lambeth, not far from where I live, funny enough. It's within walking distance of where I live, and Longfield Hall. And there's now a plaque there, Nubian Jack plaque, which was unveiled a couple of years ago on Longfield Hall in Myers-Fields. So that was historic because it was one of the first proper bases for a black theatre company.
Thank you very much. You write about a great many plays and shows in your book. Are there any that you think were particularly important? Also, more personal question, are there any particular performances of plays or shows from the past that you wish that you had been able to see, and why? I was thinking about Ira Aldridge as Othello.
I would have loved to have seen Paul Robeson's stage work, like Toussaint Louverture, which he did in 1936 at the Westminster Theatre. C.L.R. James, the Trinidadian I mentioned earlier, wrote that for him. I would have loved to have seen Errol John's Moon on the Rainbow Shore. I would have loved to have seen some of the black dramatists' work of the early 70s, like Mustafa Matura's Playmass, and some of that work, Alfred Fagon's work, pioneering work, because by then, in the early 70s, Mustafa Matura and Alfred Fagon and Michael Abensitz were from the sort of Guyana, Caribbean area originally. And they were writing plays in their own dialect, using patois, which had never really been done before. So black actors from that generation who were from the Caribbean embraced that work, because that they'd never got work like that before. But I would also like to have seen a kind of unusual production from 1968 at the Connaught Theatre outside London, a repertory company. I met Isabel Lucas, who was a black actress, who's actually Canadian, from Toronto originally. And she played Martha in Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf in 1968, opposite another friend of mine who sadly passed away a couple of years ago, Thomas Baptiste. So you had a black Martha and a black George in Edward Albee's. It had just been done on film with Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton. But they did it. She said she's sure they were the first black actors ever to play those roles. And she showed me photographs of the production. I'd love to have seen that. Because Isabel was actually from a musical theatre background and musical reviews, but this was like a really meaty stage role. So it was quite forward thinking of whoever at the Connaught Theatre decided to do that production. But there were a lot of white people, theatre producers and directors, who were innovative. I do acknowledge Frank Dunlop, because my friend Cleo Sylvester, who was a young up-and-coming black actress in Britain, London-born, in the 1960s she was working. She was the first black actress at the National Theatre in 1969. And then Frank Dunlop, she discovered, was creating multicultural theatre, culturally diverse. And I think Frank came from the National Theatre originally and then set up the Young Vic. And that's where I saw Cleo when I was at school as Bianca in Othello in 1976. And then I did a school project in 1976 on black actors. And my teacher said, go and interview a black actor. And I thought, oh, Cleo, because I knew her from television. I'd seen her on television a lot. And I remember we met at the coffee bar at the Young Vic, and we're friends to this day. I mean, all these years. There's a chapter about her and Tommy Baptiste, because they were very good friends in the book. And so, but she told me that Frank Dunlop, who wasn't black, but was very innovative in casting black actors in roles that were not necessarily black, integrated casting against type, all this kind of innovative stuff was going on. And sometimes black actors were given those opportunities. It's good to know that.
Yeah, it sounds. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Those processes and how things slowly changed and whatnot. Okay. Oh yeah. So obviously there's this large period, like a century and a half. You write about many different performers. I wondered how well known are these black performers and artists today within the black community and beyond. I would thought, especially amongst contemporary black actors and performers, whether do you think they find inspiration from those people?
Some they would, some that they wouldn't know about. Certainly Paul Robeson, Ira Aldridge are better known than some of the others I write about. Some of the others I write about, like Pauline Henriquez, should be better known, and their achievements should be better known. I don't think Pearl and Edric Connor are as acknowledged and known about as much as they should be. So if this book does anything, I hope it fills that hole that Pearl Connor told me about, which was the hole that we fall into, meaning black artists in this country, and our history, what we've achieved goes down into the hole. And I kind of almost subconsciously decided that when Pearl told me that many years ago, I had to do something about it. I take the responsibility very seriously. It's their legacy. I want more people to know. I want to be invited, like to RADA, the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art, to do this talk, to do a talk based on this book. I want to go to the Globe Theatre. I want to go to the National Theatre. Theatre Peckham, which is close to where I live, where I certainly grew up, on the housing estate at the back of Theatre Peckham when I was a kid, and they want me to come and give a talk there. So I'm kind of trying to work on this sort of thing, to actually visit some of these places where the history was created. Not Theatre Peckham, because it didn't exist then, but it's all part of that tradition.
But it's also within the kind of spaces those things took place in.
Yeah, and share these stories so that people become more aware of these trailblazers, these pioneers. But I think even sometimes Paul Robeson and Ira Aldridge and the more famous and celebrated are still not known about. I bet if you went into any school and said, "Do you know who Ira Aldridge is?" they wouldn't know. And that's got to change.
Well, moving on from that, it's a bit related. Some of the performers in your book that I've read about, I recognise myself from old films and television programmes, such as Paul Robeson, The Proud Valley. I remember seeing that when I was a very young boy on the telly. It was also interesting to see Elizabeth Welch from Dead of Night, that old British classic. And as you mentioned, Edric Connor of Vikings fame, also Moby Dick.
Moby Dick.
And you say about how he chose the song that was included in the scene in the film. I haven't seen the film for many years, but I think when I see it again,
Edric Connor is a great figure. I absolutely, again, if the book does anything, I hope it raises his profile. He died when he was in his 50s in 1968. He kind of burned himself out. He tried to do too much. But the important thing about Edric is he came from Trinidad during the war, 1944. He arrives in Britain. He goes straight to the BBC, and he's almost immediately picked up by the BBC to sing Caribbean folk songs. So he was always trying to introduce to the British public through radio, then television, then theatre, then film, like Moby Dick, the music and culture of the West Indies, of the Caribbean. That was at the forefront of, and he released LPs, songs of Jamaica, songs of Trinidad, 2 LPs in the 1950s. They're not even available on CD, which is horrendous. So a lot of the work slips through the net that these people did. But yes, he did always try to inform some of the productions he worked on, like Moby Dick, the film version, by saying to John Huston, the director, "I know a great Caribbean folk, not folk song, it was more like almost like a spiritual, Hill and Gully Rider." and can I sing that in the film? And he sang it for John Huston, and John Huston said, do it. So when they're out on the boat trying to find the whale with Gregory Peck, he's singing away. It's worth watching the film just for that moment. Edric Connor was a real trailblazer. And when you talk to people like Rudolph Walker or any of those actors that came after him, Tommy Baptiste I interviewed about him, they greatly loved him and respected him, but realized that he took on too much responsibility, because he felt the burden of what they call the burden of representation. I have to be 101% brilliant at everything I do because I'm being judged all the time in this hostile environment. And I think that's partly why Edric's health suffered and he died far too soon.
Yeah, so I suppose people are always looking for that opportunity to criticise the slightest thing. Yeah.
Or judge. I mean, there were a lot of people in this country that would judge black people and what they could or could not do. And I think Edric felt that he was an unofficial ambassador and needed to be perfect and brilliant at everything, which, judging from what I've seen and heard of his legacy, he pretty much was. It's just a shame, as I say, a lot of his music is not available on CDs, and it should be.
Okay. So I was going to ask then, in terms of films and TV, these things are more accessible to people. Are there any particular films or TV shows that you think would be you particularly recommend for people to get an insight into the subject?
It's too big, far too big and vast a subject. That's another discussion. I have covered this in an earlier book called Black in the British Frame. To be honest, there's too many. Okay. But I would recommend the BFI Player and look at their Black British film television selection, because you'll find a lot of examples of the early productions from film and TV with black actors and writers on there, the BFI Player. And they have like a Black Britain collection. Some of them are free, some of them are pay to view, but I would start there if one wanted to see examples. And YouTube is extraordinary. I mean, you never know what you're going to find on YouTube. I only a couple of days ago discovered that, although this is a different, I'm talking about America, Sidney Poitier, who everybody loves and everybody was upset when he passed away recently, he did a live television drama in America in 1955. He played the lead. It was very unprecedented, and it's now on YouTube. It's called A Man is 10 Feet Tall. I know it's getting off subject, but if one wants to see Sidney Poitier give a brilliant performance in a live television drama that was recorded, but it was a live transmission before he became the huge star that we know from To Sir With Love and In the Heat of the Night, go and look at this 50-minute television drama. It's superb, and he's brilliant in it. And in his autobiography, which I was reading again last night, he says that he blew a line during the live broadcast, but you don't notice it because the other actor helped him get back on track. Yeah.
Well, that's great. I like the reference to the BFI Player. That sounds
BFI
really interesting.
Player.
Yeah, definitely. BFI
and
Player.
YouTube. Always look up these names in my book on YouTube to see what there is of theirs on YouTube.
Okay. Well, I didn't want to do the podcast without mentioning Norman Beaton of Desmond's fame, which I remember quite fondly. Or if you'd like to say anything about him.
He was great.
I mean, yeah.
He was no, he really was the greatest. I absolutely love and adore that man. And he's not as well remembered and respected as he should be. I absolutely love and respect a lot of the work that's being done, like Patrick Vernon and 100 Great Black Britons. He's not even in that. I no disrespect to Patrick. I've got the highest regard for him, but I don't know how they could have missed him out. He was one of the greatest actors of his generation, whatever background they're from. He did tremendous work as a stage actor, as a film actor, as a television actor, as a radio actor. He did the whole lot. And again, like Edric Connor, he took that responsibility very seriously. The kind of burden of representation. You know, I am this high-profile black actor. He did so much, and I remember as a child, well, in the early 70s, as a young teenager, when he made his first impression, and that was in a ginger biscuit advert. He did a ginger biscuit advert, and he's wearing a straw hat, a colourful shirt, as all West Indian men do. And they had like this mock-up of a palm tree behind him and a little bit of sand on the studio floor. And he's saying, buy McVitie's ginger biscuits. But he made an impression. You know, we sat there.
Had a presence.
He had a presence. Yeah. He had presence, and he had charisma. And then he starts doing theatre and stage. He did a film, Black Joy, in 1977, which I went to see at the cinema. And I met him a couple of times. Wonderful, wonderful man. Really humble. I mean, extraordinary, because he could be very feisty as well, but very humble with people and very respectful of other people. He never had, in the times I met him, any sort of temperament that some performers would have. He was a lovely man, and again, like Edric Connor, he died far too soon. But there is a huge legacy there. And
because of the success of Desmond's, you don't know where that could have led as well. The roles that he might have been offered, particularly as an older actor, you know, the roles he could have played as an older actor.
Absolutely, because he was only about, I think, 60 when he died. But if he'd lived to be 70 or 80, you know, like Laurence Olivier lived to a great age, he could have done so many more great things. But the pressures were just too unbearable for him. I mean, health-wise, it destroyed him. It's but wonderful performances. Yeah, but I'm glad you mentioned him. Yeah, because there's so many.
Oh yeah, had to mention him. Yeah,
definitely. Can't mention everyone.
I won't sing the theme tune. So other than your book, of course, and you mentioned the BFI player, I wonder if there's any other sources of information you might recommend to people or to gather more information about the subject.
No, read my book.
Yeah.
Okay. No, seriously, I'm not precious. I do include further reading in the book. You have to read the book to find out what other resources I recommend in my further reading section. There isn't time to go into it now, but I am not one of those people that's so precious, you know, just read my book, don't read anybody else's. There are a few other books. I mean, Norman Beaton's autobiography, published in the 1980s, I think. I bought it as soon as it was published in 1986. Loved it. Wonderful book, wonderful autobiography, a real chronicle of an actor in this country. But they're too few. There are far too few of those kinds of books by Black British actors about their lives. So Mustafa Matura has passed on. Michael Abensets has passed on. The two dramatists I mentioned earlier, that as far as I know, they never published autobiographies. Their play scripts are available. So I'd always recommend the play scripts. The plays are published in volumes, but not. You'd have to look for interviews with them for their stories, but it's a shame they never wrote autobiographies, or were indeed encouraged to. But then I wasn't encouraged to write Deep Are the Roots, so it doesn't surprise me. There's very little out there.
Okay. I've got one last question then to finish off. You may well have covered it already, seeing as you've spoken about so much. But I thought if there's one notion or idea about the subject that you'd like people to be aware of to take away from this podcast and your book as well, what would that be?
It's going to sound very, very corny, and I don't care. Deep are the roots. It's with Black British history, which we still need to teach in our schools, because there's still too much emphasis on African Americans from history and not enough emphasis on teaching about Black Britons from history. So if you look at Black Poppies, my First World War book, about the Black soldiers and the Black community in Britain during the First World War, the roots go back that far, but they don't. They go back even further. They go back far, back to the 1500s, whatever. The Black presence in Britain. So And always keep an open mind. Always look for the less obvious. Don't just look for the racism narrative. Look for other narratives, other stories. I've found so many. I can't talk about them now. I try to get them out into the public domain, like a black Metropolitan Police and mixed race Metropolitan Police superintendent in London, in my London borough, in the 1850s. A black nurse from the West Indies called Annie Brewster. I found her grave, found her life story. The grave in London is going to be restored. Annie Brewster, she worked at the London Hospital from 1881 until she died in 1902. I've unearthed lots of examples. Some of them are in my books, some of them are not yet in my books. And it's just to take away the idea that the black presence in Britain does go back through the centuries, but it's much more richer and diverse than we imagine. And I'm just so blessed that I've stayed with it long enough to uncover so many amazing stories. But in my particular case, so wonderful that I've met so many of these incredible people.
Thank you. So I think that's a great point to end on, that we don't disregard or ignore the negative, but we acknowledge the positive as well, to have that objective overview.
Absolutely. Yeah. What I always say to people is, not all white people were racists. Not all black people saw themselves as victims. That's not to detract from the reality that we know existed. But we have to hold that in our head and just be broad-minded and open-minded when one looks back and question and challenge things, preconceived ideas. But to do it in a friendly way, not in a hostile way.
That's great. Great words to end on. Just before we finish up, I'm going to remind everyone again, because it's back there, but this is the book, but particularly this one, it's in the library, so you can come and get it and gain even more information.
You've only got one library in Hillingdon?
No, we've got 17.
Oh, well, then you must have 17 copies then.
Well, I'm not sure if we've got 17. But if somebody else has got a copy, you can always put a hold on it. So thanks everyone for watching. Tell your friends they can always watch this at another time. It's on Facebook, it's on YouTube as well. And thank you very much, Stephen Bourne. Thank you very much for your time. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.